Okay, so this is the very second part to the video you watched yesterday, matter and organic compounds part 2. Remember, I did say that I'm going to make these videos shorter, so I'm breaking this one section down into 2 different videos. It's all the same section. So yesterday you talked about elements and compounds and mixtures. Today we're going to focus more on the idea of matter and, more importantly, carbon. Carbon is an element, and we're going to talk about the importance of carbon today. So after this video, you should know how to explain why carbon is essential to all living things, and you should describe the structure and function of the 4 major types of organic compounds. Okay, so the significance of carbon. So why is carbon important? You guys have heard me say that carbon is the backbone of life. Carbon is super important, and the reason why carbon is so important is because it's an organic compound, meaning it's found primarily in living things. So basically anything that's considered living has some component of carbon in it. And why carbon is so significant is because carbon has the abilities to bond to it has the ability to create 4 different bonds. So a lot of elements can create bonds with carbon in order to become more stable. And that's really all I want you to know about carbon. Biggest thing is that carbon is so significant because it's found in it's found in all living things. Primarily, it is in all living things. You will find carbon outside of living things, but for the most part, it's just in living things. We can classify carbon in 4 different ways: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So you may be wondering why we're even talking about chemistry. The biggest thing I can tell you is that because, believe it or not, everything that our body does is chemistry. Chemical reactions occur within our body all the time. The things you eat, the things you break down in your stomach, all carbs, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. This all has to play with living things. How a living thing, a living organism functions is all thanks to carbon. So we really need to talk about the details of the 4 different ways carbon is classified. So let's go ahead and go into detail onto those 4 classifications of of carbon. So the first classification, carbohydrates, and a lot of you probably think of French fries, or some kind of food in some stores. A lot of times the carbohydrates are your yummy foods. So examples of these would be like sugars and starches. So your candies, your cookies, your cakes, and then starches would be anything like your fries, your potatoes, things like that. The elements that are mostly found in your carbohydrates are your carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Notice the common factor there is carbon, and you'll see that throughout these next few slides. The function, this is a really important portion. I really would like you to make sure you focus on the functions of all 4 of these different types of carbon. So the function is to provide energy to cells, stores energy, forms body structures. So carbohydrates have a huge role, and so you hear people that are completely cutting out carbs. Well, you can't completely cut out carbs. Everything has carbs. Some people will go on a lower carb to try and prevent the excess amount of sugar, but you still need carbs for survival. So again, these provide energy to your cells. In order for your cells to function and to do their job, they need energy. And to get that energy, you need to get it from some kind of sugar or some kind of carbohydrate in some way. Like I said, you can classify these things into 4 groups, and then you can also classify carbohydrates even further. And so we can classify those into 2 groups, and that's the monosaccharides and the polysaccharides. And you may have heard these words before. Basically, all I wanted you to know is that a monosaccharide is a simple sugar, like fructose or glucose, and polysaccharides are complex carbs formed when simple sugars bind. So a polysaccharide is basically just monosaccharides combined together. The reason why I wanted to add this is because of monosaccharides. These are simple sugars such as fructose and glucose. Glucose, and you will learn in your future, will be your best friend. Glucose is a huge energy source. We take glucose within our liver and we help our bodies to not only regulate sugar, but to just do daily functions. So glucose is super essential. Glycogen is actually the hormone that is a polysaccharide used by animals to store energy. So we store energy thanks to glycogen. Glycogen takes in glucose. We store energy in our liver and in our body cells, also known as fat. If you really wanted to know more about polysaccharides, in the reading it provides a table talking about different types of polysaccharides. So starches, glycogen, cellulose, and chitin. Those are different types of polysaccharides that you'll see in nature. So starch you use in plants to store energy. Glycogen is used for animals, more specifically. Cellulose is used for plants to build like the rigid stems and structures that they have. And then chitin is used a lot in like exoskeletons of many animals. The next category of to break down carbon is lipids. So these examples are like your fats and your oils. Again, these elements are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The function of these also is to store to store energy, form cell membranes, and to carry messages. So your lipids are really, really important. These two facts here, they do store energy, but they're not your primary focus on storing energy. Mainly, they form your cell membranes and your carrier messages. These are your guys that are going to do the dirty work for you. And we're going to talk about this a lot, especially when we get into the cell. The cell is made up of what's known as a bilipid layer or membrane, and that is what allows the transport and detransport of different things in and out of the cell. Okay, so why these are so significant is because they consist of repeating units known as fatty acids. And again, you can break these lipids, into two different groups as well. Saturated fatty acids and unsaturated fatty acids. The biggest difference, and the only thing I want you to know, is that saturated fatty acids are solids at room temperature, and that's because of the fact that they are not kinked and they're not bent in any way when you look at their actual 3D structure, in comparison to your unsaturated fatty acids, which have that bend in them. And again, your reading goes into a lot more detail into these unsaturated fatty acids. You can break these down even further, but we are not going to we're not going to talk about triglycerides, phospholipids, and steroids. We will talk about steroids when we talk about proteins and their function. We'll get to all of that, but right now, I don't really want you to focus on just that component. The third classification of carbon is known as a protein, and a lot of you have probably heard of a protein, right? A lot of you associate proteins with muscles, but they do so much more than that. So good examples of proteins are enzymes and antibodies. Antibodies, they help protect our body, right? They help fight against a foreign invader in our body. Enzymes, great at increasing and decreasing chemical reactions. Elements that make up proteins are carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. The function helps cells keep their shape, makes up muscles, speeds up chemical reactions, and carries messages and materials. Really, think of your proteins as like your workers. These are the guys that are going to undertake every single job in the body and do anything and everything that they're told to do. They don't call the shots. They don't know what kind of protein they're going to be until the instruction manual is sent to them. And we're going to talk about the instruction manual on the next slide. But proteins really are the guys that undertake everything and do those really big jobs for you. These proteins are made up of amino acids, and there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. As far as like what combination of amino acids makes what type of protein, that is not something I want you to worry about. And when you look in the reading, it says when amino acids bind together, they form long chains called polypeptides. Again, we are not going to go into details on that. Throughout this entire year, you'll see that. Another thing that you'll see is you may have ever heard of primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary protein structures. So proteins have 4 different structures. Depending on their role in the body or wherever they're found, they have a different structure. You do not need to worry about that structure. You should know that there are 4 different structures of proteins, but you don't need to know what they are and what they do. And last but not least, you have nucleic acids. These examples are DNA and RNA, and I'm fairly certain you've probably heard of deoxyribose nucleic acid and ribonucleic acid, also known as DNA and RNA. These are like the instruction manual to your entire body. How you are who you are is thanks to the DNA. You get your DNA half from your mom, half from your dad. And we're going to learn about that in detail, and you'll probably hate me when we learn about that because it's kind of hard. Anyways, the elements that make this up: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. The function contains instructions for proteins. So remember I said that the proteins are the workers. They get the instructions and they do the job. Well, here is your boss, the nucleic acids. They have all the instructions. They pass on the instructions from your parents to you. They help make proteins. They do everything and anything. So you better hope your DNA is up to par so that you can survive. What builds up DNA and RNA are known as nucleotides, and so they have these small structures. In a nucleotide, you consist of a sugar, phosphate group, and a nitrogen base. We have a model of DNA in the in the classroom, so I can show you what that looks like when I say the sugar, phosphate group, and nitrogen base. But you're going to do a model too in class, so don't worry if this doesn't make any sense. Again, all of this chemistry is important because this is going to lead into our conversations. It's great to have a background so that you know where we're going. If you have any questions, please ask me on Edpuzzle.